Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AIA Contract Documents webinar on understanding contract terminology and just going through some essential terms that we felt it was important for you to know. So I am just going to get us started with some important disclaimers here. I'm going to be going through a series of contract terms and throughout just providing you an example of a definition in the presentation today. It's to help you understand what these terms mean on a broad scale, but all of the terms I go over today should be researched and understood in the context of your own projects and your own construction contracts, as of course they may vary based on just different facts and circumstances. That being said, also keep in mind that anything I go through today in the presentation should not be taken as legal advice. The intention of the presentation is to just prompt a general understanding and guide you along as you go to do work with, again, your own projects and contracts. And as you do that, and as you encounter things that you think may require legal attention, seek out a local attorney who is licensed in your jurisdiction. So again, anything you see or hear today should not be taken as legal advice. I'm just going to start us off by introducing myself. My name is Sarah. I work with AIA Contract Documents, providing trainings to help our users and our customers better understand how to use our software to make contracts and just how to understand how to work with these contracts in general and understand who we are. In my day-to-day, I speak regularly, to our staff attorneys who work and develop construction contracts every day. And I'm here today just to pull out some of the terms that, quite frankly, I needed help with understanding as I was being introduced to the magical world of construction contracts and what definitions that I found helped me understand these concepts because I encountered them repeatedly just through discussing construction contracts in general, and especially AIA contract documents more specifically. I'm not an attorney, so I'm hoping that this presentation is helpful to contract novices like myself, just get some clarity on some terms and concepts that seasoned professionals already know. That being said, anything you see here today where you wish we could talk a little bit more about, or anything that you see that we did not cover, I invite you to just type that into your questions box and go to webinar. I likely won't be able to address it on my end during this presentation, but I absolutely will take any questions that are submitted into consideration just for future learning and training initiatives. So again, I just invite you to enter those questions or anything that you would like to see training and education on from AIA contract documents. It may not be from me, it may be from more seasoned professionals, and that is okay. I still definitely want to hear what you're interested in learning about. I should also mention that the session today is going to be recorded, and everyone who's attending today is going to receive the slides from today and a recording of the presentation. And you'll receive that via email from AIA Contract Documents. So keep an eye on that moving forward. You should get that probably sometime tomorrow before close of business. So with that, I just want to introduce, now that I've introduced myself, I want to introduce AIA Contract Documents because that provides important context on who's presenting here today. So AIA Contract Documents are the around 200 number kind of changes, forms and contracts that define the relationships involved in construction projects. Basically, they are forms and contracts that you can use as templates in your own projects. The templates are drafted, created, revised by the AIA Contract Documents Committee, which is comprised of over 30 experts in design, construction, law, and insurance from across the country. They are involved in industry research and input to revise these documents and keep them up with current construction and construction law trends. So I'm going to just briefly hop over so you can see a little bit more what I'm talking about to the AIA Contract Documents homepage. We usually refer to our templates by this alphanumeric up at the top here. And this is precisely what I'm talking about. These here you can see are most used templates, our most used documents. These are the kinds of templates that you can use for your own construction projects. And all of these templates together are AIA contract documents as a body. So we're going to be going into some more specifics on picking out some of these common templates here, but I wanted to show you exactly what I was talking about when I'm discussing AIA contract documents. And we'll be back to this home page in just a little bit. But to get us started with some important terms and concepts just to understand, I want to start with just the general term, the contract documents. So sometimes when we think of a construction contract, there may be more to it than we originally thought. So there's more to it than the owner-contractor agreement, or just the owner-architect agreement in isolation. The construction contract is really a bundle of what we call the contract documents, that being a capitalized term throughout all contract documents because the contract documents are a specified entity in the contracts. So I'm just briefly going to go over the contract documents and what's involved for, in this particular example, a conventional construction project. So design, bid, build, delivery method. So for example, and let me just briefly go back to this home page here. The general conditions document, so the AIA document, the A201, I'm briefly just going to touch on this, and I'm going to bring up just a quick sample of this document. It defines what the construction documents or what the contract documents are right away. This is the first thing that shows up in the document here, and it defines what exactly are the contract documents. Now, this is a whole definition here. I'm not going to sit here and read through this, but I am going to touch back on our presentation and take us through exactly how a contract may define the contract documents and what's typically involved. So you're going to have an agreement in the contract documents. This just defines the terms in the project combined with conditions. So this may be general or supplemental conditions, and this just coordinates each party's roles and responsibilities. Beyond that, you're also going to have drawings, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail in just a little bit, but they're going to include the plans, elevations, sections, detail schedules, and diagrams, important things for design. Specifications being the written requirements, with drawings being more graphic. Specifications are written, and these are just going to be requirements for materials, equipment, systems, standards, and workmanship, all important things to consider. You're going to have addenda, that's part of the contract documents, and modifications, the differences being that addenda are issued prior to the execution of the contract, so that original signing, and the modifications are issued after the execution of the contract. These both can come in multiple forms, but that is the key difference to think about between addenda and modifications. And then you may have other documents depending on your agreement that, again, you do define up front. So this may vary slightly depending on what contract you're using or what project you're working with. For example, if you're working with an abbreviated contract, you may not have a separate conditions document, for example. But the important thing to note is that the contract documents absolutely should be defined. They should be defined very clearly, and all parties should agree upon what's included in the contract documents. And it's not only essential to define, but it's also essential to understand because it's this bundle of documents together that really comprises the relationship here between the owner and the contractor and defines the work that is going to be performed and the work that should be expected. So it's all of these documents together that form the contract. And also it should be noted that it's important to understand in general and in the context of your own projects, because if there's a contractual issue along the way, each party needs to understand which documents were agreed upon and contractually and therefore binding in that regard, because there are tons of documents involved in any construction project. And it's important to know which ones are part of the contract because those are the ones that are legally binding. So there are a few items here that we can get into a little bit more detail here about. The first thing I'm going to bring up is I'm going to pull out the conditions here. This coordinates each party's roles and responsibilities. And this can be either general conditions, which just basically it's an umbrella document over the entire project that coordinates the rights, responsibilities, and relationship of the prime parties. In a conventional project, those prime parties are going to be the owner, architect, and contractor. However, in different delivery methods, you may have other prime parties. For example, if you have a construction manager as advisor. And then you also may have supplementary conditions, so any modifications to the general conditions. You're going to hear me reference a few times the AIA document A201. I've already brought it up right here. This is the general conditions for a conventional project here. It is a very important document and it sets forth a lot of definitions for terms that we're going to be going over today. So if you want more in-depth definitions as we go along, one thing you may be able to do is just look through a free sample that I clicked on earlier and really just take a look through this general conditions document. It includes really, really key concepts and ideas defined to form just that, the general conditions. Now, I also noted that if you're using an abbreviated contract, so in the context of AIA contract documents, if you're using an A104, the abbreviated owner-contractor agreement, the general conditions, for example, are not a separate document. The general conditions may be written throughout the agreement. So that's where your contract documents are serving the same purpose, but they're not going to look the same for every single project. Now, also pulling out this idea of these modifications. That A201 document that I was showing you defines modifications pretty exclusively, and it gives you four examples of what a modification should be, more than just examples, 4 definitions of what a modification is. So it can be a written amendment to the contract. It can be a change order, which is a written instrument that's agreed upon between the owner, contractor, and architect that exclusively outlines the change in contract sum, if applicable, and or contract time. So if you're working with AIA contract documents, for example, that change order is going to be the G701. You also may have different change orders for different projects. For example, there's a subcontractor variation. But if you want to look in that in more detail, you can take a look at, again, that free sample preview and see exactly what is involved in a change order. But importantly, you can see that it's agreed upon at the bottom here between an architect, contractor, and owner. And it's going to go over change in time and price. Beyond a change order, a modification can also be implemented through a construction change directive. So this is also called a CCD, and it's just a directive to the contractor that there needs to be some kind of change executed really quickly, just not to cause delays in the project. So this may be executed when parties may not be able to agree quite yet on the specifics, such as the exclusive change in contract sum and or time. So they're going to do a change order later. In AIA contract documents, this is going to be the G714, I believe it is. Please excuse me if that is not correct. It is. So that's going to be your construction change directive. And these are forms that, again, you can use in conjunction with your agreements and general conditions document. They're designed to effectuate the definitions and the processes set forward in the A201 or the corresponding general conditions document. And then finally, you can also have a written order for a minor change in the work as issued by the architect. So this is when the architect is just issuing like a quick minor change to the contractor that doesn't change the contract sum or time. So for example, in AIA contract documents, this is going to be the G710. and it's called Architect's Supplemental Instructions. And as you can see here, it is just a quick description of the work to be carried out. And if you're interested in looking at these forms in more detail, I'm purposely showing you exactly where you can find those on the AIA contract documents website. And then I'm going to jump back to our contract documents here. So the next two things I'm going to pull out from this list involve the drawings and specifications. So I mentioned earlier that drawings are going to graphically show the scope of work, and specifications are going to be written requirements. And you see for things such as these examples here, which I already went over, they may go over certain administrative requirements or procedural matters applicable to the work and the contract documents. So the reason I brought these out is because they can often be conflated with some things that are not included in the contract documents. So while the contract documents often include drawings and specifications, they do not include, and in our A21 exclusively do not include, three things. The first is product data. So it's just going to be the information given from the contractor to illustrate particular materials or equipments. So it's just going to elaborate on some portion of the work. Same for shop drawings. These again are going to be the graphical form of some kind of illustration to carry out some portion of the work. And same goes for samples. So physical examples when you're picking out materials, for example. So these three things provide further instruction from the contractor or subcontractor to carry out the work that's been defined by these drawings and specifications in the contract document, but they're not part of the contract documents themselves. They often just detail a specific component in the work, and they often supplement or add to the drawings and specifications. And they may show up down the road in the project's lifetime. So the next thing I want to go over, and I moved a little quickly there, I'm just going to show the contract documents one more time, just to give kind of a summary of what we've gone over. So when understanding the contract documents, another main thing that I found helpful in understanding, as again, venturing into the world of construction contracts, were contract types according to cost or price structure. So I'm just going to go over three main types of contract types. These are key differences. They'll often be completely separate agreements based on contract price structure. So the first is stipulated sum. This is also called fixed price contracts. So this is just when there's going to be one set price that the contractor is responsible for in terms of job execution. So it's a set price or fixed price. That differs from a cost plus contract in which the owner pays for however much it takes to build the work plus a contractor's fee, so a contractor's overhead. So you might hear called cost of the work contracts. Cost plus contracts can come either with or without a guaranteed maximum price or a GMP, and this just means a price ceiling. So you can have a cost plus contract with a GMP or a cost plus contract without a GMP. But these are three main and very important differences in terms of different contract types. Now, and I can show you an article, and I'll show you a place to go in just a little bit where you can get more information on contract types. There are, of course, many nuances within these different contract types, but a lot of the times you're going to see in the actual title of the contract, especially if you're working with AIA contract documents, whether it's a stipulated sum, cost plus, or with or without a GMP. Now, the next section I'm going to go through, and this is actually just going to wrap us up before I go into a few more additional resources that you can look at And that's going to be just other terminology that I think that you'll see a lot as you're working with construction contracts and that may be helpful to understand. So the first thing that I want to go over is indemnity or indemnification, or in this context, an indemnification clause. Indemnification on its own basically just means compensation or payment for loss. So an indemnification clause, which you'll commonly see in construction contracts, is basically a commitment for one party to pay another party for financial losses. So it's basically transferring the risk of loss or harm from one party to another. So one party assumes the responsibility for any claims that may be made against another party. So for example, a client may draft an indemnification clause that requires an architect to indemnify the client for any financial losses that may incur due to what they consider the architect's action or inaction. Indemnification clauses are tricky. You should be very wary of indemnification clauses because they are worded differently in different contracts. And the way that they are worded is incredibly important, as is many things with contracts, but this is a particular issue that you want to pay attention to because broad language or unclear language can really lead to major legal and insurability issues. So this term is specifically put on here so that you understand that indemnity is a big deal. It requires close attention, and it often is a good idea to get legal attention to indemnification clauses and have a lawyer review that before signing a contract because they can be very, very tricky and the wording must be very clear and very specific. So I recommend being wary of those in the future. The next thing that I wanted to just define here is allowances. And for this purpose, of course, allowances in the context of construction contracts. So allowances are basically a dollar amount that serve as a placeholder for an amount that is going to be determined later in the project. So you'll see allowances in fixed price or GMP contracts, so with that guaranteed maximum price. And allowances are commonly used for materials and equipment such as like paint, flooring, cabinetry, appliances, even things like plumbing fixtures, things that often come up down the road as going through a construction project. So for example, if an owner doesn't know yet if they want laminate or linoleum flooring, that uncertainty certainly should not prevent a contract from being signed and work to get started. So allowances allow that level of uncertainty down the road to not affect just getting pen to paper in the beginning. So the owner and the contractor can still enter an agreement and have that flexibility later on using allowances. So allowances should be a pretty realistic ballpark, basically, to use a certainly non-legal term. But they should not be used, so allowances should not include aspects of an item such as maybe labor or installation costs that can be accurately estimated ahead of time. So anything that really can be estimated ahead of time should be included as is in the original contract sum. And there's often specific language designating what allowances should and should not cover to that point, and how to proceed when that price actually does get determined. So those decisions are made often by the owner. In our A201 document, this of course is exclusively laid out. The differences in actual price and allowances down the road, whether the actual price turns out to be more or less than the allowance, is accounted for through a change order. So you will execute a change order to adjust the contract sum based on that actual price. Allowances are also often conflated, or they're brought up with contingencies or contractor contingencies. The main difference being that a contingency is a set amount of money that's set aside for unforeseen costs, but it's not allocated to any specific item. Allowances are very specifically allocated to an item. and should be resolved when that decision is made on that item. So that is what allowances, when you see those, is referring to in a construction contract. The next and last term I want to go over is a very important one, and it is substantial completion. This, of course, is a very important term in any construction contracts, and it's defined very exclusively, or should be, in your contract. So the definition on the screen, which I'm going to go through in a second, is pulled from our A201. There are a lot of contractual obligations around substantial completion, so it should be very, very clearly defined what that is. And it always is in the AIA contract documents, so you won't have to worry about that. But for example, the architect may have an obligation to certify a project as substantially complete. So for things like that, the architect needs to know exactly what substantial completion means, and especially in the context of that contract. Make sure that substantial completion is defined and that you understand the definition. So in the AIA contract documents, substantial completion is defined by the stage of progress in the work, when the work or a designated portion, so it can be done via portion. So for example, if you're building something huge like a hospital, you're going to have different portions of the work that you will certify substantial completion as you go along. It doesn't have to be the entire scope of the work at once, but it's going to say that that is sufficiently complete in accordance with the contract documents. So keeping in mind all of the contract documents that we saw earlier, it's in accordance with those, and that it can be occupied or used for its intended use. So when an architect is certifying for substantial completion, that is what they are certifying. Now, AIA contract documents has a specific document for certifying substantial completion. I am blanking on what exactly the numeric is. It is the G704. And this is the document where that architect will certify substantial completion. You may have warranties that do not commence on the date of substantial completion if you want to list any exceptions. And you may also have a punch list that is connected to this that the architect will go through. So with that, we have almost come to the end of our half hour. Again, I do encourage you to enter any additional aspects of this presentation that you want to be expanded on, and that I can work on additional learning and training initiatives to address those. So please go ahead and enter those in your questions box and go to webinar. In the meantime, we've gone over a series of different AIA contract documents as they address these terms that you should know. I just want to make clear that there's a few different ways that you can use these templates that we've gone over today. For example, if you say, hey, I could probably use that A201 for my projects, you can purchase on the AIA contract documents website a basic single document, which involves plugging in your project details, and that spits you out a standard template. If you want to edit the legal language, you can do that one by one by getting a customizable single document or unlimited customizable single documents and an unlimited one-year access license. For additional resources, and there are a wealth of them, I'll point you to our Learn page, which is aiacontracts.org/learn. You're going to see a ton of trainings and resources that go into depth about some of the topics that we've gone over today. For example, we have a webinar coming up on the fundamentals of construction change orders. If you learned a little bit about a change order today and want to get into more detail, you can sign up for that. And there are many, many, many other articles and videos on demand and live trainings that you can register for. Finally, any specific questions, you can get in touch with our content support team about anything you've gone over today. You can talk to a document specialist who can go over some of the contract terminology and usage, and some of the people that I consulted for today's presentation. So with that, we just went over a quick 30-minute webinar. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And again, you will receive a follow-up email from me that's going to include a recording and the slides from today. Thank you very much.